13 English Colonies, A Foundation for America, Part 1. So it's important to note what we talked about last week at the beginning of the Age of Exploration in the New World. This took place around the 1600s. There's many colonies competing for various territory in the New World, starting with Spain, who conquered pretty much most of Central and Southern America, and then even started to venture into North America when the rest of Europe started to catch on and started to kind of race to collect other territories in mostly Northern America, as they couldn't compete with Spain for Southern and Central territories. So there's various different reasons for them coming to the New World, some for religious purposes, some for financial reasons, hoping to get rich, some for to escape as they were prisoners and work off debt, various different reasons. For the European powers, it was mostly to either gain wealth or power from having colonies under their thumb. So, we're going to talk about three different things. First, we're going to talk about the colonial regions of New England, middle and southern parts of the English colony. Then we're going to dive into 3 of the 13 English colonies of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. All right, so in New England, the main reason for people settling this region was due to religious purposes, as most of them were what was called Puritans or separatists, which we'll get into more about later. And this particular area was made up of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. They participated in farming, fishing, lumber, trade, and shipbuilding as their forms of survival. They also experienced harsh winters, and it snowed quite frequently. In the middle colonies, they had New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They also engaged in lumber, trade, and shipbuilding. In fact, trade had become such a big thing in these colonies that in the area of Philadelphia, they were the first to create a public school, a newspaper, and a grid design for the city streets. These colonies were mostly established by the Quakers, but people began to flock to these colonies of various different cultures and religions from throughout Europe. So the southern colonies region was made up of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And essentially it was mostly rivers and wetlands, but the rich soil, warm weather, and wet atmosphere was perfect for growing cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, stuff like that, which led to the eventual development of plantations, mostly farmed by indentured servants and slaves. The government in the new colonies in America, or the English colonies of America, were mostly sanctioned by England. They were self-governing, meaning that they had to develop their own system of government. They were theocracies at first, which meant that because they had religious foundations, the rulers often took a religious approach to how they governed and the rules that they established. But eventually this gave way to city councils, which eventually elected representatives to represent them in the government. All right, so taking a look at the Massachusetts colony, these were Puritans. So Puritans were a group that wanted to break away from the English church because they were being imprisoned essentially for their disagreements with the Anglican Church, which was the main Christian church of England, headed by King Charles II, and for centuries that had been headed by the King of England. And so they disagreed with the way that things were ran, and so they became known as separatists and were imprisoned. However, a group of 50 of them eventually fled to Holland to be able to practice religious freedom, but Holland was never really home, as they wanted to be able to raise their children up on in an English society and on the values of the Bible, which is the Christian religious book. And so the group of 50 headed out to Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower, or the New World on the Mayflower, and essentially on the Mayflower, because they weren't just, the Mayflower wasn't just made up of Puritans, they had to figure out some way, shape, or form of law, and so they came up with what was an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact, which laid out essentially the rules for that would eventually follow them into the new colony when they landed in Plymouth on the eastern coast of North America. However, they would have starved to death as they arrived during winter time and had no idea how to work the land and stuff. So, however, the Indians or Native Americans were able to come to their rescue and teach them how to plant corn and other crops, and essentially how to survive in this new territory. About 10 years later, a man by the name of John Winthrop and a bunch of other Puritans set sail for the new colonies in America, and the King of England was actually glad to have them going, because the Puritans were causing quite a problem for him in England, and it also, the establishment of more presence in the New World meant more power for England. And so he officially granted the Charter of Massachusetts Bay. However, about 15 years later, when he attempted to send a governor to take back governance of the colony, it was said that the colonists hid the order in a white oak tree, and so that they could maintain their freedom. And so John Winthrop essentially established the colony based on the idea that they would follow and be governed by the rules of the Bible, as a city set on a hill with the whole world watching. Next was the colony of Rhode Island. So, as stated before, there was the Puritans in Massachusetts. However, even though it was based on the idea of religious freedom, it wasn't free for all. A man by the name of Roger Williams began teaching that forced religion wasn't a good thing. And so he was essentially put on trial. And so to avoid this fate, he snuck out in the middle of winter, leaving behind his wife and children, and harshed the wilderness. Luckily for him, some Native Americans took him in and nursed him back to health and helped him to survive the winter. He was then able to eventually establish the colony of Rhode Island. There was another woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson who essentially was a preacher's daughter at the time, or a religious leader's daughter, but she would also teach anyone who would listen. And so eventually she even taught men and women, which was strictly forbidden back then. Not to mention that it was forbidden for women to be teachers of religion. And so she was also exiled and taken in the Rhode Island colony as well. However, and then Roger Williams' family eventually joined him in Rhode Island. So, however, with Rhode Island, it became a huge trade center, and particularly in the slave trade arena, it became big on slave trade. The other colonies began calling it Rogues Island, as it was said to be made up of prisoner-like people who were made up of the ideas and concepts that were banned in their colonies or rejected in their colonies. So they were sort of rebels, so to speak. Finally, the Connecticut colony was started by a man by the name of Thomas Hooker. Now, Hooker was a Puritan who lived in town, a fast-growing community next to Boston. And he didn't always agree with the laws and leadership in Massachusetts. And so when he heard about a fertile river valley to the west, he convinced his family and about 100 other people to move there, and started a new colony there. Nearby, there was another colony that had started called New Haven, which had very strict religious laws for that time. And eventually these two came to be known as Connecticut, but not at first. And so Hooker believed that government should be based on the free consent of the people, whom could choose who the public officials were. And so with that, he put into place a system of governance called the Fundamental Orders. Initially, these two colonies weren't official colonies of England. They were kind of in rebellion, so to speak. However, eventually, King Charles II granted them charter, and this is when the two colonies became one and became Connecticut. So in part 2, we'll discover or talk about the rest of the colonies. Thank you.